As difficult as it might be to believe in this day and age, there was a time when games about farming didn't exist yet. If you wanted to plant vegetables, pet cows, or harvest crops, you had to go out to the countryside and do it yourself. Then on August 9th, 1996, a game called Bokujo Monogatari released in Japan, although you might know it better by the name Harvest Moon. Harvest Moon was created by developer Yasuhiro Wada and was inspired by his life growing up in the Japanese countryside. Harvest Moon was the original farming simulator, a game all about quiet country living, building personal relationships, and fixing a dilapidated farm that you inherit from your grandfather. After graduating from a local university, he moved to Shibuya and found a job with game development studio Pack-In Video. As the months of his life in the big city went by, he began to think more and more about his old life and the stark differences between country and city living. Cities had people, lots of awful people, a complete kind of departure from what he was used to, whereas the country was quiet, filled with a close-knit community that practically you knew everyone who was there. It was these feelings that instilled in him a deep appreciation for his old life and made him want to recreate that experience in a video game. The more Wada worked on projects for Pack-In Video, the more his desire began to grow to explore the concept of a game that could capture the essence of his old rural life. Absolutely inspired by games like Derby Stallion and SimCity, he could see the foundation for the vision he wanted, just not the final product yet. These games were proof that players out there desired more than just platformers, RPGs, and beat-em-ups. They wanted simulation games that could offer them a different kind of experience than what they were used to. And after 2 years of working on localization projects, he successfully pitched his idea to the company's higher-ups, who greenlit the project with a small budget. Wada was put in charge of a team of 10 people, including Setsuko Miyakoshi and Tomomi Yamatate. Miyakoshi and Yamatate would become his closest allies on what would become Harvest Moon, helping turn Wada's dream into a reality. Development started pretty slowly, though. They first began exploring 3 key concepts on paper: farming, interaction, and cattle. Farming is pretty obvious. He wanted the player to be able to plant and grow crops like a real farm, and he wanted you to be able to build it up day to day, gathering tools for use, planning ideal crop yields, and selling at the market. Similar to SimCity, but without the complexity of it all. Games like SimCity were great simulators, but they dealt in nothing but raw numbers. The amount of people visiting, the amount of people leaving, the amount of cash you have. Wada instead didn't want to do that. He wanted to bring the human element to the equation by allowing the player to engage in a more personal relationship. And interactivity in cattle really dealt with that idea of interacting with your environment, interacting with your animals. He believed that the cattle practically represented everything that was the core element of Harvest Moon, being able to take care and nurture your animals and grow your farm on a day-to-day basis. That's the kind of interaction he desired for his new game. It wouldn't be until a few months after they came up with these 3 concepts that an early alpha prototype was playable. Though it wasn't much, the graphics engine was very limited, and all it consisted of was a small plot of land, populated by just a few rocks and tree limbs, and a farmer that had roughly 30% of the moving animations completed for him. They wanted to test the basic clearing mechanic of managing your land, the core aspect of what would become Harvest Moon's gameplay. Luckily, they found it very fun and very satisfying to see the land, which starts off pretty overgrown and nasty, progressed to being clean and maintained by the player. But as the months drew on and they began to fit more of the pieces together for their game, they were shocked to discover that the different elements weren't working together. They just weren't cohesive or satisfying. And the prototype, which started off as fun and exciting now turned into this thing of tedious and boring. In an effort to fix this, not unlike a failed recipe, they kept adding new things to the mix, hoping to stumble over that one idea that would make the entire dish taste better. The more they added, the more sour the game began to become. The graphics engine just couldn't handle the amount of on-screen assets at the same time, and it began to suffer this massive frame rate drop as the player attempted to move objects or move themselves across the screen. The months spent adding material to the game in an effort to boost it to be more fun had to be scaled back, reverted to an earlier build. The art style had to be downgraded as well because the game just wasn't running properly. It was a staggering blow to the development team. After months of work, adding new things and chasing new ideas, what they were left with was this prototype, basically, that they had at the beginning to test the clearing mechanic. There was hope that this would be the last setback on the project, but the ultimate blow was waiting just around the corner. The studio went bankrupt. It was estimated that Wada's team had 80% of Bokujo's assets complete, but no overall game to put them into yet. A company called Victor Entertainment stepped in and purchased the bankrupt Pack-In Video, merging it with their game development division, Victor Interactive Software. But the financial stability of Wada's project was still in jeopardy. The development team were already depressed from having to revert the game's state and losing months of progress, but the studio going bankrupt really pushed Wada into a spiral. He was ready to pull the plug on his dream and call it quits once and for all. And it was thanks to the help of his two friends, Satsuko Miyakoshi and Tomomi Yamatate, that we would have a Harvest Moon at all. They suggested he not only reach out to their new owners, Victor Entertainment, for financial support, but to push forward with development and create his dream that he wanted. Victor Entertainment gave them a fraction of their old budget, barely enough money in the coffers to last a year, and the team of 10 people had to be reduced down to 3 people. To say that the 3-team studio experienced a massive crunch is an understatement. In order to get Bokujo back on track, they had a ton of work to do and a very short time to do it in. Yamatate, the programmer, threw out the old code from the previous build and started completely from scratch. Miyakoshi worked tirelessly on script, character dialogue, and helped with general planning of the project, where Wada stayed kind of on the concept and planning side of things, organizing the game's progress as they moved along at breakneck pace, day in and day out. Then after 6 months of living, eating, and sleeping in the office, Wada's dream was finally finished. The farming simulator Bokujo was ready to meet the world. Sales were going to be difficult, though. Not only because it was unknown, but also because of the timing of its release, August 1996. For reference, the N64 premiered in Japan 2 months earlier. With the new system already out in the market, expectations for Super Famicom titles were incredibly low. Everyone had already moved on to the new system. Initially, Bokujo Monogatari only started off selling just 20,000 units. Sales would rise to a little over 100,000 in just a few short months. Victor Entertainment looked at that and went, "Holy shit, we have the potential on our hands for something incredible here. So let's try to get it to as many people as we can." In an effort to do that, they got in contact with a company called Natsume and brokered a deal to localize Bokujo for the West. Natsume chose to call the localized version of Bokujo Harvest Moon. The newly minted Harvest Moon released to the SNES in June 1997 in North America, but like its Japanese counterpart, it quickly grew a dedicated following. Bokujo was always supposed to be a one-and-done type of game, just an attempt to see if Wada could capture the essence of country living. But the higher-ups at Victor Interactive had a different strategy in mind. To them, not tapping into the surge of popularity and exploring just how far they could take the farming simulator would be a massive waste. The most difficult part of launching a new intellectual property or a new game is always just getting the fans. And Harvest Moon and Bokujo Monogatari had the fans. They were there, the groundwork was there, everything they needed to create a series. And after the higher-ups of Victor Entertainment convinced Wada to continue making the series, he was given a staff, a new budget, and the directive to work on 3 new games: Harvest Moon Game Boy, Harvest Moon Game Boy Color, and Harvest Moon 64. The development team fragmented into 2 groups, one working on the Game Boy versions and the other working on mainline titles. While Harvest Moon 64 underwent development, excitement in the video game industry was growing, thanks to the recent releases of the PS1 and the Saturn systems. Wada, being a pretty enthusiastic gamer himself, loved the idea of developing for these other systems. After the Game Boy team was finished releasing Harvest Moon Game Boy and Harvest Moon Game Boy Color, they were commissioned to port Harvest Moon 64 over to the PlayStation system. This port of the N64 version would come to be known by the name Harvest Moon Back to Nature. Wada didn't want Back to Nature to just be a direct port of the N64 version. He wanted to respect the differences between consoles and give each player their own kind of unique experience. In order to do that, he gave the Game Boy team free rein on creating new dialogue and injecting new elements into the game. When Wada sat down to review the work of the Game Boy team, just a few short months before Back to Nature was set to be released, he found everything about his characters had changed. Dialogue and even the personalities of the characters had been altered drastically compared to the N64 version, and it was way too late in the project to be able to revert it back to how it used to be. The Game Boy team completely went off script and made their own thing, and that's why you get the 2 different versions of Harvest Moon 64. The release of Harvest Moon 64 and Back to Nature began a golden age for the franchise. Both games were a perfect follow-up to the original, not only expanding on its founding concepts, but improving them in a full 3D environment. They would follow this release pattern for a while, never quite recapturing the magic of the SNES, N64, PS1, or Saturn versions. The games to come weren't bad by any means, but you could definitely tell that the game development team kind of grew distant from their own franchise and stopped innovating to try new things. When the team at Victor Interactive Software, now Marvelous Inc., began work on Harvest Moon DS, development would be led by Yoshifumi Hashimoto, who would go on to create the Rune Factory series. It was here at Harvest Moon DS that Wada stepped back from game development and took on a more supervisory role within his team. He was still involved in the development process, but he left the day-to-day operations to his staff. Over time, as they moved from the Harvest Moon DS version to other titles, Wada would begin to pull away even more than he had, until one day he finally made up his mind to leave the series and pursue his own projects. The last Harvest Moon Yasuhiro Wada would be involved with was Animal Parade in 2008. He worked with his old colleagues one more time on developing his last game of the franchise, with a much younger development staff than what he was used to. He would go on to say the entire experience was a bit bittersweet. Having to say goodbye to a franchise he loved was difficult, but seeing the enthusiasm of a young, fresh development team gave him hope for the series and what was to come. They had a wealth of new ideas and a passion for the games that just wasn't with him anymore. Wada would go on to found Toybox Inc., his own game development company, and begin work on projects like Tokyo Twilight Ghost Hunters and Deadly Premonition. When 2014 rolled around, we found the series in a really awkward place. Xseed Games, a subsidiary of Marvelous Inc., became the localization arm of Bokujo in the West. They didn't need Natsume anymore to do anything with the Bokujo series. Instead of abandoning the name Harvest Moon, Natsume founded its own development studio called Tabo Inc. in 2012, and continued to release games under the Harvest Moon name. The first of those was Harvest Moon The Lost Valley, released in 2014, which received a 47 out of 100 on Metacritic, leaving many longtime fans of the series to wonder what the hell had just happened to their franchise. The game had land terraforming, graphics that looked like a mobile title, and was such a departure from the quality of its predecessors that it was hard to believe it was a game from the same franchise. Bokujo Monogatari, the original Harvest Moon as we know it, lives on under the name Story of Seasons in the West. And Story of Seasons has continued its tradition of development excellence, winning the attention of fans who understandably wonder where this farming simulator game suddenly came from. On the flip side, Natsume is continuing development on the Harvest Moon franchise, with the newest game, One World, set to release later this year. The history of Harvest Moon is definitely a chaotic one. From small beginnings on paper to the loss of its creator, Harvest Moon has experienced so many ups and downs. The real question is, will Natsume continue the trend of mediocre games, or will we see a return to form for the Harvest Moon franchise in the West? I guess only time will tell, but at least we still have Stardew Valley.